So welcome to Tuesday's edition of the Writers and Readers series here at Rosemont College. Today's guest is Jennifer Steil, who's a novelist and nonfiction writer and journalist, visiting us from London. She is an American, however, so don't expect a fancy British accent.
All right.
We won't hold it against you. So, Jennifer Steil is an award-winning author and journalist. Her novel, The Ambassador's Wife, won the 2013 William Faulkner Wisdom Creative Writing Competition Best Novel Award and the 2016 Philip McMath Post-Publication Book Award. It was shortlisted for both the Bisexual Book Award and the
Lascaux, I think.
Lascaux, there you go. The Lascaux Novel Award. Jennifer's first book, The Woman Who Fell from the Sky, is a memoir about her tenure as editor of the Yemen Observer newspaper in Sana'a. It was praised by the New York Times, Newsweek, and by the Sydney Morning Herald. The Minneapolis Star Tribune chose it as one of their best travel books of the year in 2010, and Elle magazine awarded it their Reader's Prize. Her freelance work has appeared in a variety of outlets, including the Saranac Review, World Policy Journal, The Week, Vogue, UK, Die Welt, and Time. See, I can pronounce the German. Jennifer earned a BA in theater from Oberlin College and an MFA in creative writing from Sarah Lawrence, and an MS in journalism from Columbia University. Please welcome Jennifer Steil. I imagine you've been to a lot of inspiring places. Is there any, and you've written about them, obviously, but is there any place in particular that you find extra inspiring?
Yeah. The most beautiful city I've ever seen is the old city of Sana'a, Yemen. It was built kind of before time, and it looks like it's made out of gingerbread with kind of white piping around the edges, and the windows are all stained glass. So it looks like no city that I'd ever imagined before I set foot there, and it's all these winding cobblestone streets through the city, and at night, when the windows are lit up from inside and it looks like little jewels are shining and you wander around, it's just the most magical city on earth. We are very busy supporting the Saudis who are bombing the old city, which is a UNESCO heritage site. So Yemen's in pretty dire straits right now, and the old city is always going to be a really magical place for me. It was where I got my start as a writer. It's where I made some of the most important friendships and relationships of my life. And yeah, Yemen is probably the most significant country to me in my career.
Wow. Yeah. Well, maybe you could tell everyone some of the other places you visited that were pretty significant, because you've kind of traveled a little bit off the beaten path. I mean, right. Yemen's not a place that a lot of people have visited, and I know you've spent a long periods of time in other places as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we were there for 4 years. And that was pretty fascinating. We recently spent 4 years in Bolivia, which I also loved. And one of the things I loved about Bolivia is it's so diverse geographically that it's like a million different countries in one. Like there are the Andes, and we lived at 12,000 feet. So adjusting to living at that kind of altitude was pretty tough. But also pretty inspiring to walk down. At the end of every street is like an Andes. So that was kind of exciting. And then there's the tropical lowlands. There's the Amazon River Basin, jungles. And then there's the largest salt plain on Earth, which is just the most incredible, beautiful plain. It's got flamingos and llamas and salt forever. And then they have a wine country that looks like southern France. I mean, every part of the country is so different that I have a daughter who was quite young when we were there, and when we travel to some place like Tarija or Sucre, which she would say, "When are we going back to Bolivia?" And I'd say, "We're still in Bolivia." Oh, wow. But it was so different. She couldn't believe that these two completely different places were part of the same country. So I mean, you could travel forever just within Bolivia. There's so many places to go. There's like caves that go deep into the earth. There's like mountain biking. There's monkeys.
Wow.
There's like everything. So, I mean, and our permanent home is France. So that's kind of our home base at the moment, so that it always feels good to go there, even though our house is unpainted, has no bookshelves, has 3 rooms full of boxes. So it's a work in progress, but the little village there is populated mostly by visual artists and musicians, a few other writers. So it's a pretty inspirational place to be.
So let me ask you this question. What do you do when you get stuck? Like when you're working on a long project? Do you ever get stuck? I mean, some people probably never do.
I'm not sure I actually would ever say that, just because I'm superstitious about believing in it. I'm like, if I don't believe in writer's block, then it can't happen to me. But I think part of it is I don't have time to have writer's block, because usually I have a certain amount of time before I have to pick my daughter up from school. So I just am so kind of working on a deadline at all times that I find that having a deadline makes me, you don't have time to second guess yourself. And I think that coming from a journalism background, I'm always saying to my agent, my editor, like, give me a tight deadline, make me finish it by a certain date, because then I'll do it. If you say, write this when you have time, I will never do it. But having a deadline, there's nothing like having a deadline to make you get stuff on the page. You just don't have time for all the kind of angsty, like, is this the right word kind of thing. And also because I know that my first drafts always suck, that kind of gives me the freedom to just write a fast skeletal first draft. I write the bones of something, and then I go and I put muscles on the bones. And then my third draft, I put a little bit of fat on the muscle, and then I go back and I put a few hairs on. Or no, skin and hairs, and so I build in layers, and I feel like my work, the shaping of my work and the real plotting and kind of story comes much later in the process for me. So with first drafts, the stakes are pretty low. I just need to get to the end, and then once I know how it ends, I'm like, oh, now that I've gotten to the end, I can go back to the beginning and start tinkering.
Your beginning as a writer was as a journalist, and you've taught and spoken about like what your journalism tools have done to help you as a fiction writer. Maybe you could briefly kind of like give us some tips.
Okay. Well, one of the things, I did this yesterday with my class, but one of the workshops I often do is, it was originally called 10 Tips to Writing a Gripping Lead, and it's lots of different ways into a story. I don't have all my examples before me, but they're like, a lead is the first sentence or the first paragraph of a news story. But a lot of the techniques you use for coming up with a good lead are also good techniques for coming up with the first line of your novel. So you want to arouse curiosity, or startle your reader, or have a really arresting image, or, one of the things that reporters dread are weather stories. We have to write weather stories all the time. And there was this one news story that started off with 1/5 of an inch, and then new paragraph. That's all it took to cause 30 accidents on highway blah, blah, blah yesterday. So rather than just saying it snowed, they found a different way in. And I like to give, what I think about when I'm teaching other people how to write a novel is I want to fill up your toolbox with different things that you could use or not use. I want to give you equipment that you can rummage through a drawer and pull out when you need it. So if you need to find a new way into your story, you can look through your 13 tips to a gripping lead, and pick maybe if I try coming into the lead this way, coming into my story this way, if I try entering it at a different point or in a different way. So that's one of the things I talk about. And another thing, which I'll have my students do later this week, so it's a bit of a preview, is I have students do the front page of a newspaper about their novel. So you write an obituary for someone who dies in your novel. You write a travel story about the place where the novel takes place. You write a profile about one of the main characters. You write a news story about the central event. You can write a weather story about what's going on weather-wise when your story takes place. And that's just fun. So you guys are going to be doing that.
All right. Well, I think it's time for you to read and for me to stop torturing you.
When I think of Austria, I remember what a child remembers. The coffee-warmed air of the kitchen, the rough fabric of my father's suits against my cheek, the chalk dust of my classroom tickling my nose, the crusted waves of snow, and the I'm going to get all the German pronunciations wrong, just so you know that. I'm like, why did I use so much German? Anyway, the crusted waves of snow in the Jesuitenweiss meadow that cut my cheek open when I fell off the toboggan halfway down the slope. My Annalise. My parents' voices as I sat on the third step from the top, secretly listening. It was important then to listen. I remember the tang of my mother's apricot jam spread over a thick layer of butter on crusty bread. The fungal stink of my older brother's dirty sports clothing on the bathroom floor. The smell of the square olive soap that was always slipping into the sink. I remember a plum tree in our small communal courtyard that dropped its sour, sweet fruit onto our terrace. My mother collected them and turned them into torts. The plums were small and green, more oval than the plums in Bolivia, not as sweet. I remember my mother's low voice, gathering energy to soar in our parlor. I remember the scent of rosin on horsehair, the vibrations of my father's viola, how I would hear them even after he stopped playing, and I was in bed listening to the silence, listening for it to end. I remember the inky smell of my school books as I cracked their spines, the sound of Frau Fessler's ruler smashing into my desk when she caught me with a book on my lap during math class, the way the fruit gummies from Weiss's got stuck in my back teeth so I had to pick them out with my fingernails. I remember the damp heat of Annalise's hand as she folded it with mine for the last time. I remember our neighbors' long coats decorated with flocks of badges saying only, "Ja," the bent-legged spiders on every armband and flag, pinned to every lapel, painted on our sidewalks. They even fell from the sky, flurries of paper spiders dropping onto our heads. I remember the newspapers my parents hid from me under sofa cushions. I remember lying fretfully awake, twisting the satiny border of my blanket in my fingers until my mother came and curled around me. I remember her breath on my neck, the ice of her fingers on my spine, stroking my skin until I drifted. It's the blandly quotidian details, the textures of ordinary days, that seared themselves most permanently. But there was Annalise, too. Annalise, who was neither bland nor ordinary. Annalise, who was more a part of me than not. Our mothers had birthed us in the same building a week apart, and since then there were no divisions between our households, not for us. The 3 syllables of her name were my first song. Mostly what I remember is Friedengluckhasenland. It started long before the Anschluss, when we were small and pre-literate, as we lay sprawled on our stomachs on the floor of her kitchen, scribbling with our pencils on the backs of brown paper from the grocer's. "Where do you think we lived before this?" she said, looking up at me with large dark eyes. "You've always been here, Anna. We've never been anywhere but here." Our families had lived in the same apartment building since we were born. I thought for a minute. I guess before here we were in our mother's bellies? No, I mean before we lived in our mother's bellies. Nowhere, I said. The belly's where we start. Annalise shook her head, the ends of her long hair dancing across the paper. How could we not have existed? We must have been somewhere. She traced the outline of her lips with the rubber end of her pencil as she gazed at the ceiling. At the left corner of her mouth, a faint scar curved upward so that even at rest her lips suggested a smile. "I know where I was," she said definitively. "I was in Friedengluckhasenland." Friedengluckhasenland. Peace, freedom, and rabbits, all stuck together in a single word to make a place. I stared at her. I was pretty sure that I hadn't existed before I emerged from my mother in some bloody and uncomfortable way she described in only the vaguest of terms. But I wanted to have always been with Annalise. I wanted to have come from the same place, to belong to the same land. Was I there? I looked at the rabbit lying next to me. Was Peanut? She looked at me, her eyes drifting apart as they did sometimes when she was thinking. "Don't you remember? We lived in a palace with Mutti Hassa, the mother of all bunnies. She was the queen. She still is. She's about 1,000,000 years old. No, 1,000,000,000. She's the wisest person in the world. She knows the names of all the dinosaurs and has lived in all the planets, and she can talk to trees and turn herself invisible. And she has 2 other children, Alexia and Nikola. Do you remember them?" I closed my eyes. I remember Alexia's red hair. She began to take shape in my mind, tall and thin. They were both dancers, Russian dancers. All their lives they were dancers. Until Nikola started drinking too much wine. He could have been so famous, but he started putting wine on everything. He even put wine sauce on his vegetables. Annalise glanced toward the bottles clustered near her family's waste bin. Her father's bottles. He couldn't balance anymore and was always falling down. "But not Alexia," I added quickly, anxious to save one of them. "Oh, not Alexia." And there was a Vatihasa too, wasn't there? Yes, only he died, but not of old age. My belly tightened as I thought of all the ways I was discovering that daddies could die. He died of silliness, I offered. Yes, he decided to be a soldier, but he didn't kill anyone, so they killed him. Well, it was silly of him to become a soldier. My brother Willie wanted to become a soldier, and the prospect of his absence was gnawing away at my belly like a hungry rat. Your daddy was a soldier. I know, that's what I just said. No, your real daddy, your Austria daddy. I know. Like most Austrian men his age, my father had served in the Great War. He'd even received a medal, the Kriegserinnerung Medaille, with crossed swords on the back, reserved for frontline troops or the wounded. Aren't you proud of him? I shrugged. My father never talked about the war. I guess. I just rather there were no soldiers, none at all. My father made sense only as a creator of music, not as a uniformed killer. Annalise bent her neck so our foreheads touched. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my lips as her eyes blurred together into one shining cyclopean eye. There are no soldiers in Friedengluckasenland, she whispered. No one can get in. The country is surrounded by stone walls, and the only door to get in is invisible. When invaders try to get in, the wind just blows their hands off the doorknob. The wind is a friend to Friedengluckasenland. There are no cars either, I whispered back. That way, we can run across the streets whenever we want without looking. It's so quiet there that you can hear the apples dropping off the trees. Without cars, we can hear the birds sing. We can hear the moles tunneling into the earth. We can even hear the hair of the rabbits brushing together when they hop. I closed my eyes. I have never wanted to be anywhere as much as I wanted to be in Friedengluckasenland then. No one is lazy, and everyone walks everywhere. We lay there, eyes closed, the skin of our foreheads pressed so close I felt our skin would grow together, that we could become one girl. We have always existed, Orly. So that may or may not be the beginning of that book. And I totally stole that whole idea from my daughter. So when people say they don't want to have children because they're serious about their writing, I'm like, I get all my ideas from my kid. So I don't know if I could write without her. So I'm going to read one really short scene that takes place in Bolivia, because most of the book actually takes place in Bolivia after the beginning. And she makes friends with a little Bolivian boy called Miguel. He becomes her closest friend. My parents allowed me to go with Miguel to learn my way around the city. Given the number of children his mother had to keep track of, she rarely even knew he was gone. He took me up to the Paris movie theater in Plaza Murillo, walking so swiftly I struggled to keep up. Posters outside advertised Union Pacific, but neither of us had money. From there, we walked down to the San Francisco church, which sat in San Francisco Plaza at the bottom of Calle Cigarnaga. We stood outside, staring up at the arched windows, at the bells clamoring in and out of its tall stone tower. It was grand, but somehow less so than the mountains around us. Are you allowed to go in? He said. Why wouldn't I be? Well, it's not your religion. Jews are allowed to go in anywhere we want. This is what I wanted to be true. Miguel suddenly grinned. Are you allowed to practice witchcraft? I was caught off guard. What? Magia, like making magical potions with herbs. I stopped to consider this. I don't know. Then, he set off at a swift pace up the street. Why did it seem that we were always walking uphill, whether we were coming or going? It was a city for alpinistas. We left the Iglesia de San Francisco without going in and headed up the steep Calle Cigarnaga. When we reached the narrow Calle Linares, we turned right. Mira! Miguel swept an arm before us. El Mercado de las Brujas, the witches' market. Turning to gaze into the shops that lined the cobblestone street, I wondered if I should be nervous. Are there really witches here? Aymara witches. They're called Yatiri, or Kuyiri. I tasted these words, letting them roll around in my mouth. Kuyiri. It sounded like a bird in flight. What do? They cure people. Of what? Sometimes they cure bodies, and sometimes they cure souls. Are they real? Of course they're real. He looked offended. This is a sacred place for the Aymara, a serious place. Chastened, I fell silent. As we continued up the street, I saw what I first thought were toy animals hanging over the fronts of shops and sitting atop tables on the street. Those are llama fetuses, Miguel explained cheerfully. You have to bury them under every house or the builders won't work. Horrified, I nodded as if this made sense to me. They kill so many babies? They put them under their houses? He went on, the fetuses are an offering for Pachamama, Mother Earth. They bring luck and health and they keep the builders safe. Builders are dying a lot of the times. I stopped walking. Is there a llama fetus under our building? Of course, all buildings. But you're not Aymara. I'm half Quechua. Besides, Mother Earth is home for all of us, no? Why should we not all make her offerings? You're half Quechua? Yes, my father. He didn't seem to want to elaborate, so I didn't press him, but I wondered where he was. Inside the shops, under the watchful eyes of the yetiris, we looked at all sorts of strange herbs and powders with names that I didn't understand, presumably to cure various ailments. I was careful not to touch anything, not wanting to accidentally cause magic to happen. Miguel pointed out the array of coca teas and creams for altitude sickness and pains in the body, powdered frogs, stone amulets to bring good health or good business, and dozens of compounds for virility and fertility. But I couldn't stop looking at the little llamas in widely varying sizes and stages of development. They fascinated me. They must have had to kill a lot of baby llamas. No, they don't kill them, said Miguel. They're born dead, or their mother dies and she's pregnant. I felt slightly relieved, though I have no way of knowing if this is true. There were an awful lot of fetuses to be accounted for. Do you use these things? He shrugged. If we need to. He didn't elaborate. I thought you were Catholic. I didn't understand how the witches fit into Miguel's worldview. We are Catholic, but we also believe in witch doctors and in kalawayas. Wandering healers. Why pick just one thing? He didn't understand why I found this confusing. Do you believe in witches? I don't think so, but I'm not sure. Do your parents? No, but I was uncertain. I didn't know what my parents believed in other than music. Maybe we can take them here, show them. I looked around, trying to imagine my mother's reaction to the bouquets of dead baby llamas, the strange smells of the powders, and the candles shaped like phalluses. Maybe not yet. Okay, so that's the little scene from Bolivia. Do I have time for the flash fiction?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So this is a little flash fiction piece that was performed in London in 2015. I wasn't actually there for the performance, but it was published by a group called Liars League. Okay, it's called Fault Lines, and it's based on a car accident we were in Bolivia, but it's not true. I mean, anyway. She has no memory of the accident itself. She remembers flicking her left turn signal and glancing in her rearview mirror, and then nothing until she found herself in a stopped car, sideways at the edge of the road to Lake Titicaca. I must get my daughter out, she thought. But even as this flashed through her mind, she saw her husband had already freed their 4-year-old from her car seat and was carrying her quickly across a field. She watched them for a moment, their receding backs. Heart staggering, she pushed at her door, which stuck. Don't damage the car by forcing it, she thought. The car was already damaged, beyond repair, but she did not know this until much later. She stared at the door. There was no glass in her driver's side window. She wondered why. Her husband and daughter were far away now, still moving. Their faces were turned from her. Panicking, she finally forced the door and flung herself after them. Not until she stepped out onto the dried grass did she notice the smoking minibus. It had rolled over several times and was still regurgitating screaming passengers onto the shoulder of the road. Bolivians don't wear seatbelts. Parents drive with babies on their laps, and minibus drivers rip the belts from their seats so they can squeeze in more passengers. Foreigners tend to follow the laws of their home countries, which is why she and her family were relatively unhurt. Only when she reached them and lifted an arm to touch her daughter's dark head to make sure of her wholeness did she see the blood on her own hand. Shards of glass clung to her sweater and hair. She was bleeding from everywhere, but superficially. She did not feel it. What she felt was her head. It suddenly occurred to her why there was no glass in her window. Her daughter was crying. There is a boy bleeding, she said, pointing back toward the minibus. She has always taken on the pain of those around her. He'll be okay, she answered, as if she could make it so. She turned to her husband, trembling. Was it my fault? No, he told her firmly. Tell me the truth. I couldn't bear it if it were my fault. It was not your fault, he said again, and walked off to find the police. The police found her first. You were the driver, they asked. Holding tightly to her daughter's hand, she nodded. So this was your fault. No, she began. Come with us. The policeman gestured towards his car. Her daughter clung to her leg. Where are you taking my mummy? Her husband reappeared. No one is taking your mother anywhere. He turned to the police. First of all, you can't arrest her because we're diplomats. Second of all, she needs to get to a hospital. The policeman did not know what diplomats were. He conferred with his colleague, who shrugged his shoulders. They were in a small town, more than 3 hours from La Paz. They'd probably let her go if she offered a bribe, but she couldn't do that even had she wanted to, which she did not. It was important to her that she be legitimately cleared of guilt, if there was any legitimacy in a country with a thoroughly corrupted judicial system. Her husband produced their diplomatic IDs, made phone calls, and arranged for a car to fetch them. The police disappeared with her driver's license. She sat down on the ground to hide her shaking legs from her daughter and opened a book. Though her hands rattled the pages and her teeth chattered as she read, her daughter made no comment. She listened, as though the words could save her. This was months ago. All the minibus passengers survived and got better. They sued their driver. It really hadn't been her fault. She reported her driver's license stolen and got a new one. Her daughter slept in their bed that night and every night for 2 months. At school, she was chastised for shoving other children. She wasn't allowed to dance in her year-end ballet pageant because she refused to do the steps properly. But 3 months later, she too got better. She made friends in her class and slept through the night. She quit ballet and took up piano. She herself is better now, except for the tinnitus, which doctors say she will keep. She's better, except for her marriage, which she won't. Her husband only did exactly what she would have done, what she would have wanted him to do. She would have said, had she been conscious, take her and get as far away as possible, fast. Yet she cannot forgive him. She keeps seeing the two of them, walking swiftly away, leaving her trapped. It might be different if he had once looked back, just once.